There is a 40-second moment in the Season 8 finale of Rick and Morty where Rick Sanchez, the smartest being in the universe, the man who has spent 9 years telling everyone, including himself, that nothing matters and nobody gets to him, sits with his daughter and tells her the truth. Not a clever truth, not a truth wrapped in sarcasm or buried under 3 layers of irony so he can pretend he did not say it. Just the truth. Plain, unprotected. The show does not reward him for it. He sends a message to the woman he was trying to open up for. She leaves him on red. And Season 9 premieres May 24th, 2026, carrying every single thing that moment meant, plus a fired co-creator, a new animation studio, a spin-off launching in the same year, a villain missing since 2021, and a showrunner who told the entire internet this season would prove the show still has a full tank of gas. Welcome to Ricktopus. Let's find out if he was right. The longest fall. How Season 7 nearly broke the fan base. There is a specific kind of damage that happens to a show when its audience stops being disappointed and starts being angry. Disappointment is survivable. Disappointment means people still care enough to want something better. Anger is different. Anger means the audience has started asking a question that is much harder to answer. Not whether this season was good, but whether the show deserves their time at all. Rick and Morty crossed that line in October 2023. Season 7 premiered on October 15th of that year, and within days, something unusual happened. The reviews came in, not mixed, not cautious, but genuinely hostile. On Rotten Tomatoes, the audience score landed at 33%. Not 33% for one episode, for the whole season, right out of the gate. To understand what that number means, you have to know what the show had looked like before it. Season 1 had a 97% audience score. Season 2, 97%. Season 3, which many fans still consider the best run of episodes the show ever produced, scored 95%. Even Season 4, which divided people more than any season before it, held an 85%. Season 5 dipped lower, 60%, and that dip felt alarming at the time. Season 6 shot back up to 87%. The show had wobbled, but it had always recovered. 33% was not a wobble. 33% was a floor collapsing. The critical response was almost equally grim. Season 7 scored a 63% from critics, which was the lowest professional rating the show had ever received. The prior low from critics was Season 5 at 86%. So in the space of 2 seasons, Rick and Morty went from a show critics had never rated below 86% to one sitting at 63%. Both numbers, the audience score and the critic score, were the worst in the show's history at the same time. But here's the thing that most coverage of Season 7 got wrong, and getting it wrong matters for understanding what Season 9 is actually walking into. The low scores were not purely about quality. Plenty of the 1-star reviews from audiences said, openly, that the show itself was fine. The voice acting was fine. The writing was acceptable. The problem was the reason those new voices were in the booth at all, and what that reason meant to people who had been watching for a decade. Justin Roiland had been fired in January 2023. He had co-created the show, had voiced both Rick and Morty through all 6 previous seasons, and had voiced at least 25 different characters across the series. The firing came after he was charged with domestic battery and false imprisonment, and while those charges were eventually dropped, multiple people came forward with additional allegations of sexual misconduct, some involving minors. Adult Swim cut ties with him, and the show moved forward without him. Ian Cardoni took over the voice of Rick. Harry Belden became the voice of Morty. Both of them were sound-alikes, meaning the goal was not to announce a new creative direction, but to make the transition as quiet as possible. The production team hoped that if the voices sounded close enough, the audience would accept the change and the focus would stay on the episodes themselves. Executive producer Steve Levy said publicly before the season aired that he hoped the recast wouldn't be overshadowed by the controversy behind it. That hope did not come true. What happened instead was something more complicated and, in hindsight, more revealing about the audience's relationship with the show. The Rotten Tomatoes argument that broke out was not really about whether Ian Cardoni and Harry Belden could carry the roles. Most of the 1-star reviews admitted the new voices were acceptable. The argument was about the principle. One group of viewers was giving 1 star because they believed the show had betrayed its creator. Another group was giving 5 stars specifically to counter the first group. The actual quality of the episodes almost became a side issue. This is what made Season 7's situation unique in the show's history. The show had never before been pulled into a public argument about something that had nothing to do with its episodes. Rick and Morty had always been criticized or praised on the basis of what was on screen. Suddenly, it was being scored by people who were still processing something that happened behind the scenes, years before Season 7 ever aired. There is a detail worth sitting with here. Dan Harmon, the other co-creator, admitted in interviews that he was ashamed ashamed and heartbroken about the situation with Roiland, and that it had affected the process of putting Season 7 together. He also said that Roiland had not really been present in the writer's room since around 2019, that by the time the firing became public, the show had been operating without meaningful input from him for years. Martyr, who had taken over as showrunner starting in Season 4, confirmed this directly, saying that when Roiland left, he had only really left by name. What this means is that the show the audience believed they were watching, a show shaped by both Harmon and Roiland together, had already quietly become something different long before they were told. The discovery of that gap, combined with the reason for the firing, produced a reaction that no amount of sound-alike voice work could have contained. Season 7 was not just releasing new episodes, it was releasing new episodes during the public collapse of the mythology that surrounded the show. And then something unexpected happened. Season 7, once the reaction bombing settled and people actually watched the episodes, was not a disaster. It was uneven, there were episodes that landed well and episodes that felt rushed or uncertain, but the writing itself had not collapsed. The show's core instincts, its commitment to absurd premises taken seriously, its habit of hiding emotional weight inside comedy, were still there. Critics who watched past the noise of the controversy found a show that was bruised but functional. The problem is that functional is a very low bar for a show that had once produced Pickle Rick, the Rick Lantis mix-up, and the Vat of Acid episode. Episodes that people still bring up years later as examples of what animation can do when it is operating at the highest level of its craft. Functional, for Rick and Morty, is not recovery. It is just proof that the wound was not fatal. Which brings everything to Season 8. Season 8 premiered in May 2025 and came out of the gate with a 100% critic score on Rotten Tomatoes, the highest the show had ever received. The audience score opened at 89%, the best in 8 years. The noise from the Season 7 crisis had not entirely disappeared, but it had quieted enough that people were watching the episodes again and responding to what was on screen. Critics described Season 8 as a return to form. They praised the voice work from Cardoni and Belden, the writing, the animation. The season ended with a finale, an episode called Hot Rick, that multiple reviewers called one of the best episodes the show had ever produced. By any reasonable measure, Season 8 was a success. The show had survived the hardest thing it had ever been through and come out the other side with its strongest critical reception ever recorded. But here's the part that matters for understanding what Season 9 is walking into and why this essay exists at all. The audience score for Season 8, which opened at 89%, had drifted down to 79% by the time the season ended. The early enthusiasm had not held through the full run. And some of the critical reviews, even the positive ones, contained a specific phrase that kept appearing in different forms. The show was good, but it was playing it safe. Games Radar's review put it plainly, saying that Season 8 largely played it too safe after years of crossing boundaries. The concern wasn't that the show was bad. The concern was that the show had found a comfortable rhythm and settled into it at exactly the moment when comfort is the last thing you can afford. Rick and Morty built its reputation by making the audience feel genuinely uncertain about what it would do next. Not uncertain in a cheap cliffhanger sense. Uncertain in the deeper sense of not knowing what rules the show was actually following. The first 3 seasons felt like a show that was discovering its own capabilities in real time, and that discovery was part of the experience of watching it. Season 8 felt, to at least some of the people watching, like a show that already knew exactly what it was and was executing that knowledge competently rather than dangerously. Competent and dangerous are different things, and the show, at its best, has always been dangerous. Season 7 nearly broke the fan base. Season 8 repaired most of the damage, but recovery and reclamation are not the same thing. The question Season 9 has to answer is not whether the show is still alive. The audience already knows it is still alive. The question is whether it is still alive in the way that matters, whether it still has the capacity to produce something that feels genuinely necessary rather than reliably enjoyable. That is a much harder question to answer. And the distance between where Season 7 left the show and where it needs to get back to is not a short walk. It is the distance between a 33% audience score and the era when people were camping outside McDonald's for Szechuan sauce. Between a show that people review-bombed in protest and a show that people lost their minds over because they loved it that much. Season 9 does not need to manufacture that kind of reaction. Manufactured love is worse than no love at all. What Season 9 needs to do is remind people why they ever felt that way about this show in the first place. Not through callbacks or nostalgia or careful fan service, but by doing something on screen that earns its place in the conversation about what this medium can do. Whether it does that depends entirely on what is inside those 10 episodes. And the stakes of getting it wrong are not small, because Season 7 already showed what happens when the fan base turns. And the thing about a fan base that has turned once is that it is much easier for it to turn again. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The story of how Season 7 nearly broke things is really the story of what the show was before Season 7, what it had meant to the people watching it, and why losing even a piece of that mythology hurt as badly as it did. To understand the stakes Season 9 is actually carrying, you have to go back to what the show built over its first 6 seasons, and ask a question that almost nobody is asking out loud. How much of what made those early seasons great was ever going to survive the long deal, the expanded universe, and the slow institutional drift away from the chaos that made this show worth watching at all? Section 2. The voice that wasn't there. What the Roiland firing actually took. There is a version of the Justin Roiland story that is simple. A man did bad things, the company that employed him found out, they fired him. The show continued without him. This version is clean and easy and almost completely useless for understanding what actually happened to Rick and Morty between 2023 and now. The real version is messier, and the mess is exactly what Season 9 has inherited. Justin Roiland co-created Rick and Morty alongside Dan Harmon in 2013. He voiced Rick Sanchez and Morty Smith from the very first episode through all of Season 6. He also voiced Mr. Poopy Butthole and at least 24 other characters scattered across the show's run. His voice, the slurred, rambling, half-improvised quality of Rick, the nervous, stuttering energy of Morty, was not just a performance. For a large portion of the audience, it was the sound of the show itself. When people closed their eyes and thought about Rick and Morty, what they heard was Roiland. He was arrested in August 2020, charged with felony domestic battery and false imprisonment in connection with an incident involving a woman he had been dating. Those charges were not made public until late 2022. When they became public, Adult Swim opened an investigation. In January 2023, they fired him. The criminal charges were eventually dropped due to lack of evidence, but by that point, multiple additional people had come forward with separate allegations of sexual misconduct. Some of those allegations involving inappropriate communication with minors dating back to 2013. Roiland denied all of it. Adult Swim's decision to fire him was immediate and public. The show would go on, the characters would be recast. Now here is the part of this story that almost nobody covered properly, and it is the part that changes everything about what Season 7 actually was and what Season 9 is actually doing. Roiland had not been meaningfully involved in making Rick and Morty for years before any of this happened. Dan Harmon said in interviews after the firing that he had not spoken to Roiland since 2019, not disagreed with him, not argued with him, had not spoken to him. Sources from inside the production described Roiland recording his voice work from home in later seasons, refusing to take direction, sending in audio files digitally rather than coming in to record. People who worked with him on his other projects, Solar Opposites, Koala Man, said the same thing. He had been absent in the ways that mattered long before his name was removed from the credits. Showrunner Scott Marder, who had taken over day-to-day running of the show starting in Season 4, said it directly. When Roiland left, he had only really left by name. So here is the strange situation Season 7 was born into. The show had been operating without its co-creator for roughly 4 years. The writer's room had continued, the stories had been written and produced, the episodes had aired, and the audience had watched all of them, believing they were watching something that was still, in some meaningful sense, the product of the two people whose names were on it. They were not wrong exactly. Dan Harmon was still there, still involved, but one half of the origin story had been quietly missing for years, and nobody had said anything. The firing made that hidden reality public all at once, and the audience had to process two things simultaneously. The reason for the firing, which was genuinely disturbing, and the revelation that the show they thought they had been watching was not quite the show they had actually been watching. The mythology had been running on fumes of association for years before it was punctured. This is why the Season 7 reaction was so extreme, and why it cannot be understood purely as people being upset about new voice actors. The voice change was the visible surface of something deeper. What the audience was really responding to was the collapse of the story they had been telling themselves about what this show was and where it came from. Ian Cardoni stepped in to voice Rick. Harry Belden became Morty. Both of them were chosen because they could match the sound closely enough that a casual viewer might not immediately notice the difference. This was a deliberate strategy. Executive producer Steve Levy said before Season 7 aired that the hope was for the recast not to be overshadowed by the controversy surrounding Roiland's exit. The intent was invisibility, to transition so smoothly that the show could simply continue. It did not work that way, not at first. Cardoni and Belden were not bad at their jobs. Anyone who watches Season 7 with honest ears can hear that both of them understood the assignment and executed it with real care. The Rick voice in particular, that specific mixture of exhausted genius and barely contains self-loathing, is not an easy thing to reproduce, and Cardoni did it well enough that by the middle of the season, many viewers had stopped consciously noticing the difference. Belden found the nervousness in Morty, the way the character has a habit of starting sentences he does not know how to finish. But the problem was not whether they were technically capable. The problem was that no amount of technical capability was going to solve what was actually wrong. The audience was not grieving the voice. They were grieving the idea. And ideas are not replaceable the way voices are. The show was smart enough to know this, at least in the margins. Season 7's premiere episode, which aired October 15th, 2023, was called How Poopy Got His Poop Back. The episode leaned deliberately into familiar Rick and Morty territory. Bird Person appeared, Squanchy appeared, Mr. Poopy Butthole had a central storyline. It read like the show assembling the things it knew people loved and placing them in front of the audience as a kind of reassurance. This is still the show you know. These are still the characters you care about. We are still here. The episode was almost pointedly normal. This was noted by critics at the time, and it was a choice, a conscious decision to demonstrate continuity rather than boldness. The gamble was that familiarity would calm the reaction. It did not, mostly because the people most upset about Roiland's departure were not watching the episode looking for reassurance. They had already decided. Season 7 ended up being uneven. There were episodes that worked and episodes that did not. There was no single moment in the season that felt like the kind of thing the show used to produce regularly in seasons 1 through 3. An episode so specific and well constructed that it changed how you thought about what animation was capable of. The season felt like a show still finding its footing after a significant disruption, which is exactly what it was. Season 8 was different. By the time Season 8 arrived in May 2025, Cardoni and Belden had a full season under their belts. The controversy had not disappeared, but it had settled. People who had decided to stop watching had stopped. People who had stuck around had made their peace with the new voices. And the show, freed from the impossible task of making people forget that anything had changed, could focus on just being good again. It was good. The critics' 100% score was not manufactured. The season opened with strong episodes and built to a finale, that episode called Hot Rick, that people called one of the best things the show had ever done. Cardoni in particular got noticeably more confident as the season went on. The Rick voice stopped sounding like a careful reproduction and started sounding like something he owned. But here is what needs to be said clearly about what the Roiland firing actually took from this show. Not in Season 7 or Season 8, but in the long run. And this is what makes Season 9 so important. It took the founding story. Every long-running creative project has a founding story, a version of how it came to exist that carries meaning beyond the facts. For Rick and Morty, that story was about two people with very different creative sensibilities who somehow built something together that neither of them could have built alone. Harmon brought the structural discipline, the emotional architecture, the obsessive attention to character motivation. Roiland brought the chaos, the voice, the willingness to let things get genuinely weird and uncomfortable in ways that felt like accidents even when they were not. The show existed in the space between those two approaches. That is gone now. Not because the show is worse, Season 8 suggests it might actually be better in some ways, but because the founding story is gone. The show can no longer point to its own origin as a source of meaning. It has to build a new story about what it is and why it exists, and it has to build that story through the work itself, episode by episode. Season 9 is one of the most important chapters of that new story. It is the third season after the recast. It is the season where the new voices are no longer new. They are just the voices. It is the season where the show has to stop being a show that survives something and become a show that is simply itself again. This is a harder task than it sounds. Survival is a story. Recovery is a story. What comes after recovery does not have a ready-made story attached to it. The show has to write that story from scratch, with writers who have been doing this long enough that the original energy is harder to find, with characters who have been through enough that genuine surprise is harder to generate, and with an audience that has been through enough with this show that they are watching with a different kind of attention than they were watching with in 2013 or 2017 or even 2021. What Roiland's firing took, in the end, was the ease. The show used to have a certain ease to it, the feeling that it was being made by people who were still discovering what they were capable of. That feeling is hard to fake and impossible to force. It either comes from the work or it does not come at all. Season 9 will tell us whether it still comes from the work. __quote_1__. Understanding what was lost makes it easier to understand what Season 8 was actually doing when it succeeded. The Hot Rick finale was not just an emotional episode. It was the show making a very specific argument about what Rick Sanchez has become now that the person who originally created him is no longer in the room. That argument has consequences that reach directly into Season 9, and they are more complicated than they first appeared. disappear. Section 3. Season 8 was the recovery, not the comeback. There is a difference between getting better and being back. A person who breaks their leg and learns to walk again has recovered. They have not proven they can run a race. The recovery is necessary and real and worth celebrating, but it is not the same thing as the thing that came before the injury, and pretending it is does not help anyone. Season 8 of Rick and Morty was a recovery, a genuine one, an impressive one even, but the conversation around it, the perfect critics score, the talk of return to form, the relief from a fan base that had been through 2 very difficult years, has done something slightly dangerous to how people are thinking about Season 9. It has created the impression that the hard work is done, that the show fixed itself, and now it just has to keep going. That impression is wrong. And Season 9 is where being wrong about it is going to cost something. Start with what Season 8 actually was, measured honestly. The season premiered on May 25th, 2025 on Adult Swim. Critics who received the first 4 episodes early were genuinely enthusiastic. The show opened with a 100% score on Rotten Tomatoes from critics, the highest rating the show had ever received in its entire history. That is a real number, and it means something. The critics who reviewed it were not being generous out of relief. They were responding to episodes that were genuinely well-made, funny, and emotionally alive in ways that Season 7 had often struggled to be. The audience responded warmly too. The opening audience score landed at 89%, which was the highest audience rating the show had received in 8 full years, all the way back to Season 3 in 2017, which scored 95%. For a show that had just come off a 33% audience score, 89% felt like a miracle. Reviewers pointed to specific things that worked. The season leaned into smaller, more contained stories rather than the large, connected plot lines that Season 7 had tried to build. Rick and Morty at its best has always known how to make a single episode feel complete. A beginning, a middle, and an end that all belong together and leave you feeling like you just watched something that knew exactly what it was doing. Season 8 returned to that instinct. The premiere, which focused on summer in an unusual way for a season opener, drew praise for expanding the show's willingness to let characters other than Rick and Morty carry an episode. Subsequent episodes were described as ludicrous, clever, and stuffed with what makes the show reliably enjoyable. Vivid animation, sharp writing, and the kind of absurd body horror that the show has always used as its signature. The finale, Hot Rick, elevated everything. It became one of the most discussed episodes the show had produced in years. The story centered on Rick's relationship with Beth, with Memory Rick, a kinder version of Rick that had been established earlier in the show, invading Beth's mind and causing chaos that forced Rick to confront his own failures as a father. Rick ultimately talked Beth down from a genuinely dark moment and chose to protect her in a way that felt new for this character. Critics called it emotionally devastating. One reviewer said they almost cried. The consensus was that Hot Rick proved the show was still capable of producing something that mattered, not just something well executed, but something that would stay with you. So why is this a recovery and not a comeback? Because of what happened between the opening weekend and the finale. The audience score that had launched at 89% drifted down to 79% by the time the season ended. That is still a good number. 79% is considerably better than the 51% Season 7 finished with, but the direction of the movement tells a story. The people who showed up for the first episode, enthusiastic, relieved, ready to love the show again, were not all still fully satisfied by the time the credits rolled on Hot Rick. Something in the middle of the season did not hold them at the level of engagement the opening had promised. Some of this is just the nature of how audience scores work over the course of a season. Early enthusiasm tends to be high and then settles as more casual viewers add their opinions. But 10 points is a meaningful drop, and the critical reviews of Season 8, even the positive ones, started to contain a specific word that should make anyone paying attention slightly nervous: safe. Games Radar, reviewing the first 4 episodes, said the season largely played it too safe after years of crossing boundaries. The review was not negative. It praised the writing and the voice performances and the animation, but the observation underneath the praise was pointed. A show that built its identity on making the audience feel genuinely uncertain about what it would do next had started to feel like a show that knew exactly what it was going to do and was doing it competently. The difference between those two things is the difference between a show that is alive and a show that is running well. This is the specific trap that Season 8 walked into and that Season 9 has to walk out of. Rick and Morty, across its best seasons, operated on a principle that is easy to describe and almost impossible to manufacture deliberately. Every episode felt like it might do something that the show had never done before. Not necessarily something bigger or louder or more plot-heavy, just something that the audience had not already learned to expect. The Ricklantis mix-up, which aired in Season 3, was not a bigger episode than the ones around it. It did not have higher stakes in the traditional sense. What it had was a structure structural choice, the decision to tell a story entirely from the perspective of background characters in the citadel of Ricks, with Rick and Morty themselves barely present, that felt genuinely surprising. Nobody had seen that episode coming, and nobody was quite sure the show was allowed to do that. That feeling, the feeling that the show was not quite sure what it was allowed to do and was going to find out in real time, is what made the early seasons feel like discovery, and it is what Season 8, for all its genuine quality, did not fully recapture. The season was consistent. Consistency is valuable, but consistency is also the thing a show produces when it has learned its own lessons well enough to stop taking risks. Season 8 felt like a show that had studied what worked in seasons 1 through 3, identified the patterns, and applied them carefully. The application was skillful, the episodes were good, but the episodes felt assembled rather than discovered. There is a moment that captures this tension precisely. In Season 5, Episode 4, there is a line delivered by Rick in an episode about interdimensional cable, where the characters comment on a show within the show. Morty says a particular show kind of messed itself up by adding extra elements. Rick agrees. He says it shows a lack of faith in the core concept. The joke is self-aware in the way Rick and Morty jokes often are. It is commenting on itself while pretending to comment on something else. The show knows the danger of adding noise to drown out the signal. Season 8 did not add noise, but it also did not quite trust its core concept enough to let it breathe in the way that Seasons 1 through 3 let it breathe. The difference is subtle. It is the difference between an episode that goes exactly as far as it needs to go and one that goes slightly further than you expected and leaves you sitting with something uncomfortable afterward. The Hot Rick finale was the exception. And the fact that it was an exception, that it stood noticeably above the rest of the season in terms of emotional impact, is itself part of the argument. A show operating at its peak does not have one episode that is clearly better than everything around it. It has a season where the quality is high enough throughout that the finale feels like a destination the whole journey was earning, not a single strong episode surrounded by solid but unremarkable ones. Season 8 was the show proving it could walk again. That was necessary. That was real. The audience needed to see it, and the writers needed to demonstrate it to themselves. Coming off the Roiland crisis, off the Season 7 reaction, off 2 years of uncertainty about whether the show had permanently lost something, Season 8 needed to exist exactly the way it existed. But now it has existed. The proof of survival is in the record. And Season 9 cannot be another proof of survival. It has to be something else entirely. The showrunner Scott Marder said in a Reddit discussion that Season 9 would convince everyone the show had a full tank of gas left. That is a very specific kind of promise. A full tank is not a repaired tank. A full tank is not a tank that is mostly fine and will probably get you where you are going. A full tank means the show has as much to give right now as it has ever had. That the distance it can travel from this point is not shortened by everything that has happened. Season 8 was the show proving the tank was not empty. Season 9 has to prove it is full. These are not the same proof. One is about minimum function. The other is about maximum possibility. And the audiences for those two things are not asking the same question. The audience that came back for Season 8 was asking, is this still worth watching? They got their answer. The audience that will come for Season 9 is asking something harder. Is this still the kind of show that changes the way I think about things? That second question is one that most shows never have to answer. Most shows build a consistent audience by being reliably enjoyable, predictably good in the ways their audience has learned to appreciate. Rick and Morty is not supposed to be that show. It was never supposed to be that show. Its founding premise, the whole reason it exists, is that it is unpredictable in ways that matter and surprising in ways that stay with you. Season 8 was a recovery. It earned the right to be called good again. What it did not do, and could not do given everything the show had been through, was prove that good is still enough. Season 9 has to prove that good is not the ceiling. It has to prove that this show, in its 9th year, with new voices and no co-creator and a deal that guarantees it exists through Season 12 whether it earns it or not, still has the capacity to do something that nobody saw coming and nobody will forget. That is a significant distance from where Season 8 left things. And the Season 8 finale, as genuinely beautiful as it was, made that distance harder to cover, because now the bar for emotional impact has been raised by the show's own best recent work. Season 9 cannot just match Hot Rick. It has to earn its place next to it. __quote _2___. The gap between recovery and comeback becomes even harder to close when you look at exactly what Hot Rick left on the table. The finale gave Rick a kind of emotional resolution that the show has been building toward for years. But resolution, in storytelling, creates a new kind of pressure. When a character finally changes, the story owes the audience something for that change. Season 9 has to pay that debt, and whether it pays it well or plays it safe again will determine whether the comeback is real or just the recovery by another name. Section 4. The weight of quote 3. What Season 8's finale demanded of Season 9. There is a specific kind of episode that changes the rules of a show going forward. Not because it introduces a new character, or a new location, or a new plot line, but because it does something to the main character that cannot be undone. It moves them. Actually moves them. Not in the fake way that television characters often get moved and then reset to their original position by the following week. In the real way, where what happened in that episode lives inside every episode that comes after it, whether the show acknowledges it directly or not. Hot Rick is that kind of episode. To understand why, and why it places such a specific and heavy demand on Season 9, you have to understand what the episode actually did. Not just what happened in the plot, but what the show was saying through the plot. Because Hot Rick is not really about Memory Rick escaping containment and invading Beth's mind. That is the surface of the episode, the mechanics that get the characters from one place to another. What the episode is actually about is whether Rick Sanchez is capable of choosing the people in front of him over the pain inside him. For the entire run of the show, that question has been the engine underneath everything. Rick is the smartest person in any room he walks into. He can build anything, go anywhere, solve any problem. And yet the one thing he has never been able to solve is himself. His wife Diane was killed, murdered by a version of Rick from another reality, a villain the show called Rick Prime. That loss defined Rick. It explained his drinking, his cruelty, his need to keep moving, his inability to stay anywhere long enough to feel the weight of what he had lost. Diane was not just a backstory detail. She was the reason Rick was the way he was. The Omega device, which had appeared in Season 7 during the episode called Unmortrican, was a weapon created by Rick Prime specifically designed to destroy the memory of Diane across every dimension. It worked. By the time Rick Prime was dead, and the revenge arc that had been building for years was finally over, both Rick and his daughter Beth had only fragments left of their memories of Diane. The device had taken even that from them. Hot Rick begins with Rick having made a decision. He wants to move forward. He has been seeing a woman named Bug Ann, a former associate from a group called the Defiance, and Bug Ann wants more from him than a simple arrangement with no strings attached. She invites him to meet her family at a ceremonial event. Rick, for once, wants to say yes, but he knows that as long as the last remaining memory of Diane is sitting inside his mind, he cannot fully be present for anyone else. So he uses a memory device, a machine he built to remove emotional memories, and he extracts his last memory of Diane. He lets it go. This is already an enormous moment for this character. Rick Sanchez voluntarily choosing to release his grief rather than carry it as armor is not something the first 3 seasons of this show would have allowed. The Rick of Season 1 used pain as fuel and called it philosophy. He dressed his inability to connect in the language of intelligence. Nothing matters. Caring is a weakness. The universe is meaningless, so attachment is foolish. All of it was a wall. All of it was a way of never having to sit with what Diane's death had actually cost him. Hot Rick shows Rick choosing, clearly and without being forced, to lower that wall. But the episode does not let him have an easy victory. Because while Rick is trying to be emotionally available for the first time in 40 years, Memory Rick, the gentler, more loving version of Rick that had been established in earlier episodes of Season 8, escapes the containment Rick had placed him in and gets inside Beth's mind. Memory Rick's goal is not malicious in any simple sense. He loves Diane. He does not want Rick to erase her. He invades Beth's memories and reshapes them, presenting himself as the loving father figure Beth never had, manipulating her sense of what is real and what is not, all in service of finding the last memory of Diane that Rick discarded. What happens to Beth as a result is genuinely disturbing. Her memories become confused and then combative. Versions of her own past self become sentient inside her head and start fighting each other. She loses track of what she actually believes versus what Memory Rick has planted. She attacks Space Beth, her clone, or possibly the original Beth. The show has always kept that deliberately unclear. And in one of the most unexpected moments the show has produced in years, Space Beth appears to die from the attack. Beth's breakdown reaches its lowest point when she holds a weapon to her own head, believing that the only way to save her family is to remove herself from the equation. She has been so thoroughly confused about what is real and who she is that self-destruction seems logical to her in that moment. And Rick comes, not with a device, not with a solution. He comes as a father. He talks to her. He tells her that memories are always distorted versions of reality, that even Memory Diane, the version of his wife that Memory Rick had been protecting and trying to restore, had agreed to Memory Rick's plan and helped manipulate Beth. He tells Beth that the real Diane, the actual woman he loved, would never have done that, would never have used her daughter as a vessel for someone else's grief. He tells tells her this not because it fixes anything. Beth cannot verify it, cannot check it against her own intact memories, but because it is the truth as Rick understands it. He is offering her something real in a moment when everything around her has become artificial. Space Beth, it turns out, is not dead. Rick revives her. The immediate crisis is resolved, but the resolution carries more weight than the crisis. Because what Rick did in that room, the way he chose to be present, to be honest, to prioritize his daughter over his own discomfort, is new. It is not unprecedented in the entire history of the show. There have been moments across the seasons where Rick's love for his family has broken through the wall he keeps around himself. But those moments have always felt like slips, like the wall briefly failing, rather than Rick choosing to lower it. Hot Rick is different. Hot Rick shows Rick making a choice, consciously, deliberately, at a moment when he could have reached for a technical solution instead. The episode ends with Rick driving out to a quiet patch of space and pulling out a small containment unit, the one holding Memory Rick and Memory Diane. He does not destroy them. He gives them their freedom, ejects the pod so they can live together somewhere away from him and the Smith family. And as he says goodbye to Memory Diane, the last version of his wife he will ever interact with, a song plays. The song is called Don't Look Back, and this version of it is specifically titled Diane's version. It was composed for the show and had appeared in earlier emotional moments across the season. Its return here, at this exact moment, lands with a weight that reviewers described as genuinely heartbreaking. Then Rick goes home. He sends a message to Bug-Ann. She leaves him on red. The man who tried to be better did not get a reward for trying. The emotional growth did not produce an immediate happy outcome. The show is not interested in telling you that opening yourself up always works out. It is interested in telling you that Rick tried, and that trying was itself the thing that mattered, regardless of what Bug-Ann decided. This is the most mature thing Rick and Morty has ever done with its central character, and it is exactly why Season 9 carries a weight that none of the previous seasons have carried in quite this way. Because Rick has changed. Not completely. The show is too honest for that. Not permanently in a way that will never be tested again. Good storytelling does not work like that. But genuinely changed. In a direction that has been building across the entire post-Roiland era, and has now been stated as clearly as the show knows how to state things. Rick Sanchez, in Season 8, chose connection over isolation. He chose honesty over protection. He chose his daughter over his grief. Season 9 now has to decide what to do with that. This is not a small decision. Shows that allow their main characters to genuinely change face a specific challenge. That shows with static characters never have to deal with. A changed character has to keep being changed. If Rick in Season 9 is the same closed-off, dismissive, emotionally armored person he was in Season 2, then Hot Rick did not mean anything. It was a beautiful episode that the show then chose to ignore, which would make it worse than if it had never happened. The audience would feel the betrayal of it, specifically because the episode had asked them to care. But if the show commits to the change, if Season 9 actually explores what Rick looks like when he is trying to be more available, more honest, more present, then it has to do something even harder. It has to make that version of Rick as interesting as the closed-off version. Because the closed-off version had the advantage of mystery. The man who never lets you see inside him is always going to have a kind of tension that keeps you watching. The man who has started to open up has to earn his interest through what he does with that openness, not through the drama of withholding it. Executive producer Steve Levy said in a Reddit discussion that he was excited about where the show would take Rick over the next few seasons, noting that Rick had come a very long way from who he was in the first episode. That statement was made with genuine enthusiasm, not as a defensive claim. The people making the show believe the direction Rick is heading is interesting. Season 9 is where that belief has to prove itself on screen. The characters who have grown the most across a show's run are either the most compelling or the most disappointing, depending entirely on whether the show was brave enough to follow through on its own choices. Hot Rick made a choice, a big one, earned across 8 seasons of careful groundwork. Season 9 does not get to pretend that choice did not happen. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The pressure Hot Rick places on Season 9 is really about one thing at its core: whether this show is willing to live with the consequences of its own best work. But there is a different kind of consequence waiting in Season 9, one that has nothing to do with Rick's emotional journey and everything to do with a villain the show promised years ago and has not yet delivered. The longer that promise sits unanswered, the more the audience has to wonder whether the show still intends to keep it at all. Section 5, the 100-episode deal and what it actually means. There is a number that sits underneath every conversation about Rick and Morty's future, and almost nobody talks about what it actually means. The number is 100. 100 100 episodes. That is the original deal Adult Swim made with Dan Harmon and Justin Roiland back in May 2018. A commitment to produce at least 100 episodes of the show across multiple seasons. At the time it was announced, it was described as one of the biggest renewals in the history of adult animation. The headline was celebratory. The subtext was something more complicated. To understand why, you have to understand what 100 episodes means in practical terms for a show like this. Rick and Morty runs 10 episodes per season. 100 episodes is 10 full seasons. When the deal was announced in 2018, the show had produced 31 episodes across 3 seasons. The renewal was essentially saying, we want 4 to 5 times more of what you have already made, guaranteed, regardless of what happens. Adult Swim was not buying the next season. They were buying the next decade. For a network, this makes obvious sense. Rick and Morty had become one of the most talked about shows on television. Its merchandise was selling. Its cultural footprint was enormous. Locking in that many episodes at once protected the network's investment and guaranteed that one of its most valuable properties would not disappear or move elsewhere. From a business standpoint, it was a smart move. For the show itself, the implications were different. The 100-episode deal was later extended even further. Ahead of Season 8's premiere in 2025, Adult Swim announced that Rick and Morty had been renewed through Season 12, meaning 2 additional seasons beyond the original 100-episode commitment. The show that was supposed to run until Season 10 is now contracted to run until at least Season 12. That is a minimum of 120 episodes, assuming the current pace of 10 per season continues. And executive producer Steve Levy said in a Reddit discussion in September 2025 that he believed the show would get a 13th season as well. Showrunner Scott Marder responded to that same question with a joke about his car lease, hoping for a Season 13 too. The joke is funny. It is also the kind of joke that contains something true inside it. A showrunner whose job security extends through Season 12 at minimum, with strong signals pointing towards Season 13, is not operating under the same conditions as a showrunner who is fighting every year to prove the show deserves to continue. The financial pressure is different. The institutional pressure is different. The urgency is different. This matters because urgency is one of the things that made Rick and Morty great in its early seasons. Seasons 1 through 3 were made by a show that did not know how long it would last. The gaps between seasons were enormous. Season 2 ended in October 2015, and Season 3 did not premiere until July 2017, nearly 2 years later. During that gap, the show's cultural presence grew to a size that nobody had anticipated. When Season 3 finally arrived, it premiered with an April Fool's Day surprise drop of the first episode. Just put it online, with no warning, no announcement, no build-up. That episode, which opened in a fast food restaurant with Rick delivering one of his most famous monologues about the Szechuan dipping sauce from a McDonald's promotion in 1998, became one of the most discussed television moments of that year. The show made that move because it could, because it was operating with the freedom of something that was not yet guaranteed, not yet institutionalized, not yet a certified money-making property with a multi-year contract and a spin-off in development and renewal through Season 12. It was still, in some meaningful sense, a show that was figuring out what it was allowed to do. That version of the show is gone, and it was gone before the Roiland firing, before Season 7, before any of the recent drama. It was gone the moment the 100-episode deal was signed in 2018, because that deal changed the fundamental nature of what the show was. It turned Rick and Morty from a creative project into an entertainment property. Those are different things, and the difference shows up in the work over time. An entertainment property has to justify its existence on a schedule. It has to produce episodes at a consistent pace to meet the terms of the deal, to satisfy the network, to maintain the audience's habit of watching. It has to be manageable. It has to be plannable. All of those requirements push against the exact qualities that made the show remarkable in the first place. The chaos, the surprise, the willingness to take a creative risk that might not pay off. By the time Season 9 airs, the show will be in its 9th consecutive year of production under that kind of pressure. Levy confirmed in that same Reddit discussion that they had Season 9 in the final stages of completion, Season 10 already in production, and Season 11 already in the writing stage. 3 seasons being worked on simultaneously. The pipeline is running. The machine is operating. Machines are efficient. They are also, by their nature, the opposite of chaotic. There is something specific that happens to long-running animated shows when they reach this stage of production industrialization. The Simpsons is the most famous example. A show that in its first 8 seasons produced some of the most inventive television comedy ever made, and then gradually became a very well-oiled machine that produces technically competent episodes that nobody talks about following week. Family Guy was canceled, came back, and then became a content delivery system that generates episodes on schedule with declining connection between them. Both shows are still running. Both shows are fine. Neither show is what it was. Rick and Morty has always claimed to be different from those shows. It has always positioned itself as a show that cares about quality over quantity, that would rather take 2 years between seasons than rush something out that is not ready. The Season 3 gap was painful for the audience, but it produced what many consider the best run of episodes the show has ever had. The long wait signaled that the people making the show took it seriously enough to refuse to rush it. That gap is gone now. Season 8 premiered in May 2025. Season 9 is set to premiere in May 2026, 1 year apart, same as the gap between Season 7 and Season 8. The show is now operating on an annual schedule, which is fast for an animated series with the ambition and production complexity that Rick and Morty has always claimed. Martyr and Levy clearly believe this pace is sustainable. The confidence in their AMA responses was genuine. These are not people who sound like they are struggling to fill episodes. Levy rated Season 9 at the top of his personal quality scale and said Season 10 was equally strong. Martyr said the episode ideas were still really flowing. There is no evidence from the people making the show that the pipeline is producing anything other than material they are proud of. But pride in the product and the product being genuinely surprising are two different things. A writer's room that has been working together for years, on a schedule, with a guaranteed contract, tends to produce work that reflects its own accumulated wisdom. That wisdom is real and valuable. It produces episodes that are well-structured, emotionally coherent, and consistent with what the show has established over its run. It does not always produce episodes that feel like discoveries. The 100-episode deal also changed something about what failure means for this show. In the early seasons, a bad episode was a genuine risk. It could damage the show's momentum, contribute to a sense that the show was losing its way, potentially affect whether it got renewed. Now, a bad episode is just a bad episode. The show runs through Season 12 regardless. The contract does not care whether any individual episode is brilliant or mediocre. It cares that the episodes get made. This does not mean the people making the show have stopped caring. By all available evidence, they have not. But caring and being structurally protected from the consequences of not caring are different things, and the protection changes the environment even when the people inside it have the best intentions. Season 9 is the 9th season of a show that is contracted through at least Season 12, producing episodes on an annual schedule with 3 seasons in various stages of development simultaneously, for a network that considers it one of its most valuable properties. All of those things are true at once, and all of those things push, gently but consistently, in the direction of comfort rather than risk. The specific episodes of Season 9 will be titled, according to the show's own wiki, things like Erickerhead, Jer Bud, Mord Gully the Last Rick Forest, Rick Day 7 Nights, Rick Foo Hustle, Salute Your Morts, Sericnity 2019, and There's Something About Morty. These titles suggest the show is still in the business of absurd premises and playful wordplay, which is reassuring. They do not tell you whether the episodes inside those titles will feel genuinely necessary or reliably enjoyable. The difference between those two things is the entire argument of this essay, and the 100-episode deal is the structural reason why reliably enjoyable has become the easier path. Season 9 cannot afford to take the easier path. Not because the deal is a problem. It is not. The deal is what allowed the show to survive the Roiland crisis and come out the other side with the stability to produce Season 8 as well as it did. But because the deal creates a comfort that the show has to actively work against. The guarantee of continuation is also, if the people inside it are not careful, the guarantee of complacency. Martyr's claim that Season 9 will prove the show has a full tank of gas is a direct response to this concern. He knows the concern exists. He is addressing it publicly, with his name attached to it. That is either confidence or accountability, and Season 9 will determine which one it was. Quote, _5, the 100-episode deal reshaped the conditions under which this show gets made. But there is another kind of pressure that operates completely independently of contracts and schedules. The pressure of a promise the show made to its audience years ago and has not yet fulfilled. That promise has a face. It has one eye. And every season it does not appear, the question of whether the show still intends to keep its word gets louder. Section 6. The Showrunner's Bet. Scott Martyr's quote 6. Claim. There is a particular kind of pressure that a person creates for themselves when they make a public promise about something they have not yet delivered. The promise does not disappear when the conversation moves on. It sits there, quietly, and waits. And when the thing they promised finally arrives, it gets measured not just against what it is, but against what they said it would be. Scott Martyr made that kind of promise. And Season 9 is where it either pays off or comes back to haunt him. Martyr has been the showrunner of Rick and Morty since Season 4. A showrunner is the person most responsible for the day-to-day creative decisions on a television television show, what stories get told, how episodes are structured, what the season as a whole is trying to say. When the show is good, the showrunner shares the credit with the whole writer's room. When the show is bad, the showrunner absorbs most of the blame. It is a job that requires both creative judgment and the ability to manage a large group of talented people, all pulling in slightly different directions. Martyr took over from Dan Harmon and Justin Roiland at a difficult moment. Seasons 1 through 3 had been made with both co-creators deeply involved in the day-to-day work. Season 4 marked the beginning of a new era where Martyr was the primary decision-maker and both Harmon and Roiland had stepped back from the daily operations of the show. Harmon remained involved, but at a greater distance. Roiland, as has been established, was barely present at all. What Martyr inherited was one of the most beloved and high-pressure franchises in adult animation, at the exact moment when the people who built its reputation were no longer the ones running it. He has been navigating that reality for 5 seasons now. Season 7 was his hardest year, producing episodes during a public scandal about the co-creator, with new voice actors being introduced mid-run, against a backdrop of audience anger that had nothing to do with the quality of what he was putting on screen. Season 8 was his vindication, the 100% critic score, the emotional resonance of Hot Rick, the sense that the show had found its footing again. And then, in September 2025, he sat down for a Reddit AMA with executive producer Steve Levy and said something that landed differently than standard promotional language usually lands. He said that Season 9 would convince everyone the show had a full tank of gas left in it. Read that again carefully, because the specific words matter. Not that Season 9 would be good. Not that Season 9 would be an improvement on Season 8. Not that Season 9 would demonstrate the show's continued commitment to quality. He said it would convince everyone. Full tank. The language of maximum capacity, not comfortable competence. The language of a show operating at its ceiling, not safely within its established range. This is a significant thing to say publicly when you are the person responsible for delivering it. Promotional statements from networks and producers tend to be carefully vague. Words like exciting and ambitious and the best yet are standard vocabulary that nobody holds anyone accountable for because they are too general to be measured. Full tank of gas is different. It is an image. It is specific. It sets a standard that can actually be evaluated. Either Season 9 feels like a show running at full capacity, or it does not. There is no comfortable middle ground in that language. Levy added his own weight to the claim. When asked to rate Seasons 9 and 10 using a personal scale, where 1 is the best and 5 is the worst, he said Season 9 was a 1 and then reconsidered, saying he could go either way between Seasons 9 and 10 because both of them were some of their best work. He used the phrase, some of our best work, not some of our most recent work, not solid work given the circumstances, some of our best work, placed in the same category as the seasons that built the show's reputation in the first place. These are people who have been making this show for years. They know what it looks like when an episode is great and what it looks like when an episode is just fine. When they say Season 9 is some of their best work, they are not being vague. They are making a claim about where this season stands in the full history of the show. Adult Swim president Michael Aweline joined the chorus when the Season 9 premiere date was announced in March 2026. He said he knew it was his job to say the show kept topping itself, but that it also had the benefit of being true. He described what viewers would see from the very first frame as great high-concept madness combined with some of the best character writing ever done. He said what the show was doing season over season was kind of scary in terms of the level of talent and effort being poured into it. Network presidents are paid to be enthusiastic about their shows. That is understood. But Aweline's statement landed slightly differently than standard promotional enthusiasm because of its specificity. Best character writing ever done. Not strong character writing, not a return to the show's roots, ever done in the entire history of the series. So now, Season 9 is carrying 3 separate public claims from 3 separate people who are responsible for making it. Martyr's full tank, Levy's some of our best work, Aweline's best character writing ever done. These claims do not exist in a vacuum. They are part of the record. They were said publicly, with names attached, before a single episode of Season 9 had aired. This is how expectations work. The people making the show have not just set the bar, they have described exactly how high it is. And the audience, which has been through Season 7's 33% and Season 8's careful recovery, is going to measure Season 9 against those words in a way that is more direct and less forgiving than usual, because the people who make the show told them to. There is something else in Martyr's AMA responses that goes beyond the promotional statements and gets to something more specific about what Season 9 is actually attempting. He said the episode ideas were still really flowing, and that Rick still had plenty of mean left in him. The second part of that is worth examining carefully. Rick still has plenty of mean left in him. This is a deliberate choice of language from someone who spent all of Season 8 building building toward a finale about Rick choosing connection and vulnerability over his usual armor. Hot Rick showed Rick being soft, genuinely, meaningfully soft, in a way that felt earned and true. And then Martyr, describing what Season 9 is going to do, emphasizes that Rick still has mean left in him. These two things are not contradictions. A person can be trying to grow and still be capable of cruelty. Rick Sanchez has never been a character whose best qualities canceled out his worst ones. He has always held both at the same time, and the tension between them is where the show's most interesting storytelling lives. But Martyr's choice to specifically highlight the mean suggests that Season 9 is not going to let the emotional progress of Hot Rick make Rick into a softer or more comfortable version of himself. This is actually reassuring. One of the risks that the Hot Rick finale created was the possibility that the show, having allowed Rick to have a genuine breakthrough, would spend Season 9 exploring a warmer and more settled Rick who has learned his lessons and is now a better person. That version of Rick would be less interesting. The show knows this. Characters who have resolved their central tension stop being compelling because the tension is what makes watching them feel like something is at stake. Martyr is signaling that the mean is still present. The growth is real, but it does not neutralize the damage. Rick in Season 9 is still going to do things that are wrong, still going to hurt people, still going to reach for cruelty when connection is harder. And the show is going to make that interesting rather than simply disappointing, which is a much harder thing to pull off than it sounds. Season 9 is also, according to information Martyr shared in the same AMA, going to deal with the idea of false reality in a way that is different from how the show has approached it before. He said there was a really cool episode in Season 9 that dealt with false reality in a totally different way from past episodes like Fear No Mort, which was the Season 7 episode about the fear hole and the simulated realities it created. He did not give details, but the fact that he specifically referenced false reality as a theme suggests the show is continuing to circle one of its core philosophical interests, the question of what is real and whether it matters. This connects directly to what Hot Rick established. Beth's mind was manipulated so thoroughly that she could not tell the difference between her real memories and the ones memory Rick had planted. Rick told her that memories are always distorted versions of reality. The show is not done with this idea. Season 9 is going to keep pulling at it. What all of this adds up to is a season that, according to the people who made it, is ambitious in specific and describable ways. Not just generically strong, but attempting something that the show has not done before, featuring character work that may be the best in the show's history, and carrying forward the emotional groundwork that Season 8 laid without letting that groundwork calcify into something safe and comfortable. These are enormous claims to have made before a single episode has aired. The thing about enormous claims is that they are either vindicated or they become evidence. If Season 9 is as good as the people who made it say it is, then Martyr's full tank language will be remembered as confidence rather than overreach. If Season 9 is merely good, solid, consistent, well-crafted, but not genuinely surprising, then the specific language he used will sit in the record and make the gap between what was promised and what was delivered visible in a way that vague promotional language never would have. Martyr has been running this show long enough to know the difference between an episode that is working and one that is not. He is not guessing. He has seen Season 9. He knows what is in it. When he says full tank, he is describing something he has already experienced. Season 9, premiering on May 24th, 2026, will tell the rest of us whether his confidence was justified. And the audience watching it will be carrying every word he said into the first episode with them. __quote _7 __. Martyr's confidence is about what the show can do from a creative standpoint. But there is a separate dimension to what Season 9 has to navigate that has nothing to do with creativity. It is structural, and it involves a villain whose absence has become its own kind of statement. Every season Evil Morty does not return, the show is making a choice. Season 9 has to reckon with whether that choice is still the right one, because the longer the answer is delayed, the more it starts to look like the show is afraid of it. Section 7. Evil Morty and the Unresolved Villain Problem. There is a version of Rick and Morty that most people remember from the early seasons. A show that introduced ideas casually, almost carelessly, and then turned around 3 or 4 episodes later and revealed that the casual introduction had been the setup for something much bigger than it appeared. The show had a habit of hiding its most important moves inside what looked like throwaway moments. A background character who turned out to be central. A joke that turned out to be a confession. A single shot of someone in the crowd that the show would not explain for 2 more seasons. Evil Morty was introduced this way. He first appeared in Season 1, Episode 10, an episode called Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind. At the time, he appeared to be the villain of that specific episode. A Morty who had turned against his Rick, was controlling him from behind the scenes, and was using a network of Mortys as a kind of shield against detection. The episode resolved. Evil Morty removed his eye patch, disappeared disappeared into the crowd of Mortys and was gone. Most shows would have left it there. A clever one-off villain, memorable for the twist of a Morty being the dangerous one rather than a Rick. The episode worked on its own terms and did not obviously demand a continuation. But Rick and Morty is not most shows, or at least it was not in the seasons when it was operating at its best. Evil Morty came back. He reappeared in Season 3, Episode 7, an episode called The Ricklantis Mix-Up, which is widely considered one of the greatest episodes the show has ever produced, and is regularly cited as a high point not just of Rick and Morty, but of adult animation in general. In that episode, told entirely from the perspective of background characters in the Citadel of Ricks, a reform-minded Morty runs for political office in the Citadel and wins. The episode spends its entire runtime building a portrait of a society, the Citadel, where thousands of Ricks and Mortys live together, and then in its final moments reveals that the reform candidate was Evil Morty all along. He wins the election. He immediately consolidates power. He kills the Ricks who opposed him and ejects their bodies into space. The last image of the episode is Evil Morty alone in his new office, looking out at a universe that he has just taken a significant step toward controlling. The episode ends there. The show does not follow up immediately. Rick and Morty, the characters, never find out what happened. The audience is left with the image of Evil Morty in power and no immediate indication of when or whether that power will become relevant to the main story. This is the show at its most confident and most maddening at the same time. Confident because it trusts the audience to hold on to something without being immediately rewarded for holding it. Maddening because the reward is not guaranteed and the waiting is not comfortable. Evil Morty returned again in Season 5. The Season 5 finale, a two-part episode called Rick Munis and Rickternal Friendshine of the Spotless Mort, though more commonly referred to by fans as the Evil Morty episode, finally gave his character the space to explain himself. He revealed that the central finite curve, the framework that Rick had built around the infinite multiverse to ensure that every dimension with a portal gun was a dimension where Rick was the smartest person alive, was itself the cage he was trying to escape. Every Rick across every dimension had constructed a reality designed around their own dominance. Every Morty in that system existed in relation to a Rick. Evil Morty wanted out. He wanted to exist in a version of reality not defined by Rick Sanchez. He opened a portal to outside the central finite curve. He walked through it. The portal closed behind him. That was Season 5. That was 2021. Since then, across Season 6, Season 7, and Season 8, Evil Morty has not returned to the main story. He has been referenced. The central finite curve and its implications have continued to be relevant to the show's world building. But Evil Morty himself, the single character in the show's history who has most completely and deliberately defeated Rick Sanchez on Rick's own terms, has been absent for 3 full seasons. Showrunner Scott Marder addressed this directly in the September 2025 Reddit AMA. He confirmed that the decision to kill off Rick Prime at the end of Season 6, rather than keeping him as a long-term villain, was deliberate, and that part of the reasoning was to set up Evil Morty as what Marder called the true, genuine villain of the show going forward. His exact words were that Evil Morty was the true, bona fide villain on the show, and that the removal of Rick Prime was designed to create space for that. This is an enormous statement when you sit with it. The showrunner of Rick and Morty has publicly confirmed, with his name attached to it, that Evil Morty is the primary villain of the series. Not a recurring antagonist, not a fan-favorite character who might come back for a good episode someday. The villain. The central opposing force to the main character in what is now confirmed to be a show with a genuine ongoing story. And he has been absent for 3 seasons. The math here is uncomfortable. If Evil Morty is the true bona fide villain of the show, and the show has been running for 3 seasons since his last appearance, then either the show is building towards something genuinely significant, using his absence the way a good story uses the silence before a major moment, or the show has been deferring something it is not quite sure how to handle. Both of those possibilities carry weight for Season 9, but in different ways. If the absence is intentional, if Marder and the writer's room have been carefully building the conditions under which Evil Morty's return will land with maximum impact, then Season 9 is potentially the season where that return happens, or at least where the groundwork becomes visible. The show has spent Season 6 resolving the Rick Prime arc, Season 7 establishing new voices and stabilizing the show's identity, and Season 8 doing deep emotional work on Rick's relationship with his family and his grief. All of that, read charitably, could be preparation. Getting Rick to a place of genuine emotional openness before Evil Morty returns to challenge it. Removing the earlier villain to clear the stage for the more complicated one. Building a Rick who is trying to be better so that when he faces a version of Morty who rejected the entire relationship that defines him, the confrontation has the maximum amount of meaning behind behind it. That reading makes Season 9 the beginning of the most important arc the show has ever attempted. Evil Morty is not just a powerful antagonist. He is a philosophical challenge to everything Rick represents. He is a Morty who decided that being defined by Rick was a prison, not a gift, and who had the intelligence and will to escape it. In a show whose central emotional argument is about whether Rick's relationship with Morty is ultimately good for both of them, Evil Morty is the character who answers that question from the darkest possible angle. His existence says, this relationship produces monsters. His existence says, the best version of Morty is the one who got away. Rick cannot defeat that argument with intelligence alone. He cannot portal gun his way out of the philosophical problem Evil Morty represents. The only answer to Evil Morty that means anything is Rick being genuinely different from the Rick who created the central finite curve in the first place, which is exactly what Season 8 spent 10 episodes building toward. But the other reading, that the absence is not fully intentional, that the show has been deferring Evil Morty because handling him properly is genuinely difficult and the writer's room has not yet found the right way in, is also available. And if that reading is correct, then Season 9 has a problem. Long-running shows that establish major unresolved threats and then delay addressing them past a certain point start to lose the audience's trust in a specific way. Not the explosive distrust of a Season 7 situation, where something external causes a crisis. A quieter, more corrosive distrust. The gradual suspicion that the show does not actually know what to do with its own best ideas. The Simpsons introduced long-term mysteries it eventually stopped pretending to resolve. Lost built an entire mythology it could not fully pay off. The longer a promised story beat sits undelivered, the more the audience starts to wonder whether the delivery was ever really planned. 3 seasons is not yet past the point of no return for Evil Morty. Martyr's confirmation that Evil Morty is the true, bona fide villain is recent enough to function as a genuine signal rather than a defensive response to fan frustration. The show has not abandoned the thread, but it has let it sit long enough that Season 9 needs to do something with it. Not necessarily bring Evil Morty back in full, but at minimum give the audience a sign that the show knows where this is going and is moving in that direction with intention. Levy's comment in the AMA that he was excited about where the show would take Rick over the next few seasons, and that Rick had come a long way from the pilot, suggests that the character arc and the villain arc are being developed in parallel. That the Rick who is ready to face Evil Morty is a different Rick than the one who built the central finite curve, and the show is deliberately building that difference before it brings the confrontation. If that is the plan, it is a good one. It is the kind of long-form storytelling that the show was always capable of and that its best seasons demonstrated. The question is whether Season 9 is the season where that plan becomes visible to the audience, or whether it is another season of excellent individual episodes that leave the larger story exactly where it was. The audience that has been waiting since 2021 for Evil Morty to matter again has been patient. Fans of this show have a demonstrated capacity for patience. They waited nearly 2 years for Season 3 and were rewarded with something genuinely great. But patience is not infinite, and a show that tells its audience it has identified its central villain and then produces 3 seasons in which that villain does not appear is asking a lot. Season 9 is where the patience starts to have a cost, if it is not at least partially rewarded. Not necessarily with Evil Morty's full return, but with something that makes the 3-season wait feel like preparation rather than avoidance. __quote_8__. The Evil Morty question is about whether the show is still brave enough to follow through on its most ambitious promises. But there is a different kind of bravery that Season 9 has to demonstrate. One that has nothing to do with storylines or villains, and everything to do with whether the physical act of making this show has changed in ways that the audience will feel before they can explain why. Section 8, the spin-off problem, when a universe expands before it's ready. There is a moment in the life of almost every successful creative franchise when the people who own it look at what they have built and make a specific kind of decision. The decision is not to make the thing better. The decision is to make more things like it. To take the world that one successful show created and fill it with other shows, other stories, other entry points for audiences who want more of the same universe but cannot always wait for the main event. Sometimes this works. Sometimes the expansion makes the original feel larger and richer and more worth caring about. And sometimes the expansion does the opposite. It dilutes the thing that made the original special, spreads the creative energy across too many projects, and leaves the audience with the quiet feeling that the universe they loved has become a product line rather than a story. Rick and Morty is now in the middle of making this decision, and Season 9 is the first main series season to premiere while that decision is already in motion. The history of Rick and Morty's expansion into other projects goes back further than most people realize. The Vindicators, the superhero team that was introduced in Season 3 and given their own episode in that same season, season, became the basis for a short animated series called Vindicators 3: The Return of Worldender. It was released in 2022 as a 10-episode web series set in the same universe as the main show. It existed, it was made. It did not change how anyone thought about the main series. Then came Rick and Morty the anime. This was a different kind of project, a full animated series produced in Japan by Takashi Sano, released in 2024, retelling and expanding on stories from the main series with a completely different visual style and creative approach. It was not made by the American Writers' Room. It was not produced by the same studio. It was a licensed version of the show's world, handed to a different creative team in a different country to do something different with. The anime exists in an interesting space. It is not quite canon and not quite non-canon. It draws from the events and characters of the main series, but is not bound by them in the way that the main series is bound by its own continuity. Fans engaged with it with curiosity rather than urgency. It was interesting to see what another creative team did with these characters, but it did not feel like something that would affect what happened in Season 9 or Season 10. Then, at San Diego Comic-Con in July 2025, the same weekend that the Season 8 finale was about to air, came the announcement that changed the nature of the expansion entirely. President Curtis. President Curtis is not a peripheral project. It is not a web series. It is not a foreign production handed to a different team. It is a full animated series for Adult Swim, set in the same universe as Rick and Morty, created by Dan Harmon himself alongside a writer named James Siciliano, who has been part of the Rick and Morty production for years. It will star Keith David reprising his role as President Andre Curtis, the character he has voiced in the main series since Season 2. The supporting cast includes Stephanie Beatriz, known for Brooklyn Nine-Nine, and Jim Rash, known for Community. Adult Swim president Michael Aweline said at the announcement that President Curtis was a series they would have made even if it had nothing to do with Rick and Morty, that the character and the world around him were strong enough to stand completely on their own. Harmon and Siciliano described Curtis as the only person in the multiverse who could go face-to-face with Rick and still hold political office, and said the spin-off would let audiences go on science fiction missions from Curtis's perspective for the first time. The show is slated for 2026, the same year Season 9 of the main series is airing. Take a moment to absorb what that means in practical terms. In 2026, audiences who want to engage with the Rick and Morty universe will have the option of watching Season 9 of the main series and also a brand new spin-off series set in the same world, featuring a character from the main series created by one of the two co-creators of the original show. Two Rick and Morty universe products running simultaneously from the same network aimed at the same audience. This is new territory for this franchise, and it creates a specific kind of pressure on Season 9 that has not existed in any previous season. The pressure is this. For the first time, the main series has to justify its own centrality. In every previous season, there was no question about where the story of Rick and Morty lived. It lived in the main show. The characters, the mythology, the ongoing arcs, all of it existed in one place, and the audience knew where to find it. The show did not have to compete with itself for attention or relevance. It simply was the thing. Now, it has to share the universe with a show that has Harmon's name on it, features a character audiences already love, and is being positioned by the network as something strong enough to stand completely on its own. That last part is the most interesting piece of Aweline's statement. He said they would have made President Curtis even without its connection to Rick and Morty. This is the network president telling the audience that the spin-off is not dependent on the main show's coattails, that it has its own value that does not require Rick Sanchez to be present, which is a compliment to the spin-off and, quietly, a raised bar for the main series. If President Curtis can be great on its own terms, then the main series cannot simply rely on the audience's existing attachment to Rick and Morty as characters. It has to be doing something that President Curtis is not doing. It has to be earning its place at the top of this universe's hierarchy, not through familiarity, but through the actual quality and ambition of what it puts on screen. This is an argument that Season 9 has to make with its episodes, not with its marketing. President Curtis is built around a character who has always worked best in small doses. His appearances in the main series, particularly the Season 2 episode Get Schwifty and the Season 4 episode The Rick Churian Morty Date, worked precisely because he was contained. He showed up, served his narrative purpose, and left. The humor of his character comes from the collision between the absurd situations Rick creates and the president's attempts to manage them using the normal tools of political power, which are completely useless against interdimensional chaos. Whether that dynamic can sustain a full series on its own is an open question. The announcement was enthusiastic, and the creative team is genuinely talented. But spin-offs built around supporting characters who worked perfectly in supporting roles face a specific challenge. The thing that made made the character interesting was often the contrast with the lead, and without the lead, the contrast disappears. Curtis without Rick is just a president dealing with weird things. With Rick, Curtis was a specific kind of comedy about the collision between institutional authority and pure chaos. What this means for Season 9 is that the main series cannot afford to be the version of itself that plays it safe. If Season 9 produces 10 episodes that are consistent and well-crafted and reliably enjoyable, the audience will enjoy them, and then they will move on to President Curtis to see what is happening over there. The main series will have become one option in a menu rather than the only place to find what it offers. The show has to be irreplaceable. Not in an arrogant way, not by claiming that nothing else can compare, but in the simpler and more demanding way of being so specifically and uniquely itself that no amount of universe expansion can substitute for it. The Rick and Morty that audiences fell in love with in seasons 1 through 3 was irreplaceable, not because nothing else was good, but because nothing else was doing exactly what it was doing in exactly the way it was doing it. Season 9 has to be that version of itself, the version that cannot be replaced by a spin-off, an anime, or any other product that carries the franchise name. The version where Rick Sanchez and Morty Smith doing something together produces a feeling that no other combination of characters in this universe can produce. There is also a creative energy question that comes with having multiple projects running simultaneously. Dan Harmon, who is still the most important creative voice in this franchise's history, even in his reduced day-to-day role, is now a co-creator of President Curtis. His attention, his ideas, his instincts, some portion of all of those things is now going into a different show. The Rick and Morty writers' room has been operating without his full presence for years, and Season 8 proved that it can produce great work under those conditions. But the creation of President Curtis makes official something that had previously been informal. Harmon is building a different story now, in parallel with the one he started in 2013. This is not necessarily bad for Season 9. Martyr and the writers' room have demonstrated they can run the show with excellence, but it adds another layer to the question of what the main series is and where its creative center lives, at exactly the moment when that question most needs a clear answer. Season 9, premiering in May 2026, with President Curtis arriving later in the same year, is not a coincidence of scheduling. It is the franchise making its biggest expansion move at the same time the main series is trying to prove it has a full tank of gas. Both things are happening at once. The audience will be watching both, and the comparison will be inevitable. The main series has one advantage that no spin-off can replicate. It has 9 seasons of history. It has Rick and Morty themselves, the specific relationship between a genius who cannot admit he cares and a kid who cannot stop caring despite everything, which is the emotional engine that every other project in this universe is built around. President Curtis can be excellent. The anime can be fascinating. None of them can be the thing that started all of this. Season 9 has to remember that, and then it has to earn it. Quote 9 The spin-off expansion changes. The external landscape Season 9 is navigating. But there is a change happening to the show itself. Internal, structural, invisible to most viewers, that may affect Season 9 in ways that are felt before they are understood. The people who built the physical look of this show for its entire run are no longer involved. What that means for what ends up on screen is something the audience will discover in May, whether they are looking for it or not. Section 9. The animation transition. No more Bardell, no more safety net. There is a quality to the way Rick and Morty looks that most people who watch it regularly have absorbed without ever consciously thinking about it. The way Rick's face moves when he is annoyed versus when he is genuinely angry. The difference is subtle, but it is there, and it communicates something. The specific way Morty's body language collapses when he is scared. The slight forward curl of his shoulders. The way his eyes go wide in a manner that is different from surprised wide. The texture of the backgrounds in Dimension C-137 versus the flatter, stranger environments of episodes set elsewhere. The timing of a visual gag. The exact number of frames a reaction face holds before the scene moves on. None of these things are accidents. All of them were built and refined and made consistent across 12 years by the same animation studio, working on the same show, learning season by season what this world looked and moved like. That studio was Bardell Entertainment, and as of Season 9, they are gone. This is the most underreported story in Rick and Morty's current production history. When the Season 7 premiere aired, almost every piece of coverage focused on the new voice actors. When Season 8 was announced, the conversation was about whether the show had recovered from the Roiland crisis. When Season 9 was confirmed, the headlines were about the premiere date and the "No AI Slop" tagline. The departure of Bardell Entertainment, the company that animated every single episode of the show from season 1 through season 6, and 11 episodes of seasons 7 and 8, has received almost no mainstream attention. It should receive attention, because what Bardell took with them when they left is not something that can be replaced by hiring a different studio and giving them the character designs. Bardell Entertainment is a Canadian animation company based in Vancouver. They have worked on dozens of projects across their history, but their relationship with Rick and Morty was one of the longest and most defining partnerships in the show's production history. They came onto the project at the very beginning, in 2013, when Rick and Morty was a new show with no established visual language and no proven track record. They built the look of the show alongside the writers and directors season by season, refining the way characters moved and expressed themselves and inhabited their world. By season 3, the season that most fans consider the creative peak of the show, Bardell had been working on Rick and Morty for 4 years. The animators working on those episodes knew these characters. They knew how Rick moved when he was performing confidence versus when something had genuinely gotten through his armor. They knew the exact timing of a Morty panic. They knew how to make the show's most absurd visual ideas feel grounded in the same physical reality as its most emotional moments, which is a harder trick than it sounds. The visual consistency of the show's best seasons is not separate from the writing quality. It is part of it. Animation that understands its characters emotionally tells part of the story that the dialogue is not telling. The transition away from Bardell began partway through the post-Roiland era. 11 episodes of seasons 7 and 8 combined were still animated by Bardell, which means the changeover was gradual rather than immediate. The remaining episodes of those seasons were handled by a different studio, whose name has not been prominently publicized in the available production information about season 9. What is confirmed, clearly and specifically, is that season 9 marks the first season with zero involvement from Bardell Entertainment. The studio that built the visual identity of this show from the ground up is no longer part of it. Why did this happen? The available record does not give a definitive public answer. Studio transitions on long-running animated shows happen for many reasons: cost, scheduling, capacity, creative disagreements, or simply the natural end of a long working relationship. None of the parties involved have made a detailed public statement about the reasons behind the change. What is known is the outcome. A new studio is now responsible for making Rick and Morty look like Rick and Morty. This is a significant challenge. Maintaining the visual consistency of an established animated series when you change the production studio is one of the harder problems in animation. It is not simply a matter of having the character model sheets and following them. Character model sheets tell you what a character looks like in a neutral position. They do not tell you how that character moves when they are thinking, or what their face does in the half second before they say something important, or how the background art should feel in an episode that is primarily comedic versus one that is reaching for something genuinely sad. These are things that get learned over time by people who work on a show long enough to internalize its grammar. Bardell's animators had 12 years of that grammar. They had animated Rick and Morty through their full emotional range, through Pickle Rick and the Ricklantis mix-up and the A Rickle in Time structure experiment and the Total Recall memory parasite episode and the devastating final moments of the season 3 finale. They had seen every version of these characters and had built the muscle memory to render those characters accurately across an enormous range of situations. The new studio is starting without that accumulated knowledge. They have the model sheets, they have reference footage from 12 seasons of existing episodes. They presumably have access to the directors and producers who can provide guidance on what feels right and what does not. But they do not have 12 years. And 12 years is not something that can be compressed into a production timeline, no matter how talented and dedicated the people involved are. The question for season 9 is not whether the new studio is capable. They were clearly deemed capable by the people who hired them, and the promotional materials released so far, including the animatic clip Adult Swim posted in February 2026, and the short promotional piece called Rick and Morty Megasphere, released in March 2026, suggests the visual presentation is being handled with care. The question is whether the audience, which has 12 years of visual expectations built into their relationship with this show, will feel something slightly different without being able to immediately explain why. This is how visual consistency works on long-running shows. The audience does not consciously track whether a character's eyebrows move the same way they moved in season 3. They are not taking notes on whether the timing of a visual gag matches the timing they have come to expect, but they feel it. When something is slightly off, when a character expression holds a frame too long or releases too quickly, when a background has a different texture than the one their brain has associated with that location, when the movement during an action sequence has a different energy than the movement they remember, they feel it as wrongness, without being able to name the source. This is the subtle risk Bardell's absence creates. Not that that Season 9 will look bad. The promotional materials suggest it will not look bad. The risk is that it will look slightly different in ways that register as absence rather than change. That the audience's body-level familiarity with 12 seasons of one studio's work will create a quiet friction with what they are seeing from a new studio, and that friction will affect how they receive the episodes even when they are genuinely excellent. There is historical evidence for how this plays out. When long-running animated shows change their primary animation studio, the transition period tends to produce episodes that are visually competent but subtly inconsistent. Characters look right from a distance but slightly off up close. The texture of familiar environments shifts in ways that are hard to articulate. The emotional expressiveness that had been refined over years at the previous studio takes time to rebuild at the new one. The audience picks up on this before they can describe it, and it affects their overall impression of the season even when the writing is strong. The Simpsons went through multiple studio transitions over its run. Each transition produced a period where longtime viewers felt that something was slightly different about the way the show looked, even when they could not identify exactly what had changed. The show adapted each time. The new studios learned. The familiarity eventually rebuilt. But the learning period is real, and it costs something in the short term. For Season 9, the learning period and the first full season with the new studio are the same thing. There is no buffer. The audience will see the new studio's version of Rick and Morty for the first time in Season 9, without any prior seasons to have established their expectations with this particular team. This is not a fatal problem. It is a real one, and it is one that the show's creative team clearly anticipated. The investment in promotional materials that showed what the new season looked like, the early release of the animatic clip and the Megasphere short, all of these were opportunities to let the audience begin adjusting their expectations before the season premiered. The team is not pretending the transition is not happening. They are managing it, but management is not resolution. The full test of whether the new studio has captured the visual grammar of this show is not a promotional clip or a short. It is 10 full episodes, each with their own range of emotional demands, visual set pieces, and character moments that require the animators to communicate something specific and accurate about who these people are and how they move through the world. Season 9 will be that test, in public. With an audience that has 12 years of expectation built in, and a critics conversation that will notice and discuss any visual inconsistency in detail, the animation transition is the invisible pressure on Season 9. It is not in the marketing, it is not in the promotional quotes from Martyr or Owleen or Levy. It is in the frame-by-frame work of a new studio trying to do justice to a visual language it did not build, for an audience that knows that language more intimately than they know it. If the new studio has genuinely internalized what Bartle built over 12 years and made it their own, Season 9 will feel seamless. The transition will be invisible. The episodes will look like Rick and Morty looks, with all the specificity and emotional precision that phrase implies. If they have not quite gotten there yet, if Season 9 has the look of a show that is close but not all the way there, the audience will feel it. They may not be able to name it, but they will feel it as a low-level wrongness underneath otherwise strong episodes, and that wrongness will affect how the season lands in ways that no amount of excellent writing can fully compensate for. This is the risk that nobody is talking about, and it may be the one that matters most. __quote_10__. The animation transition is a change to how the show gets made that the audience will discover by watching. But there is one more change, the most publicly visible, the most deliberately positioned, and the most culturally loaded claim the show has attached to Season 9. That says something about what the people making this show believe they are fighting against. It is 2 words in the official description of the season, and those 2 words are doing more work than they appear to be. Section 10. The __quote_11__ positioning and what it reveals. There is a sentence in the official description of Rick and Morty Season 9 that is doing far more work than it appears to be doing on the surface. The full description reads like this: Rick and Morty is back, baby. Season 9 is all certified bangers. No AI slop, just grade A organic slop made by real humans with real human traits like back hair and cysts. Please watch, or we'll have neglected our families for nothing. The whole thing is written in the show's voice. Jokey, self-aware, slightly absurd. The kind of promotional writing that feels like it was made by someone who actually watches the show, rather than someone in a marketing department trying to sound like they do. The jokes land. The tone is right. But underneath the jokes, in 3 specific words placed right in the middle of that description, is something that is not a joke at all. No AI slop. Those 3 words are the most culturally loaded thing in the entire Season 9 marketing campaign. They are not there because someone in the Adult Swim promotional department thought they sounded funny. They are there because the people making Rick and Morty looked at the entertainment landscape in 2026 and decided that the single most important thing they could say about Season 9, more important than the premise, more important than the character arcs, more important than any specific plot detail, was that human beings made it. The fact that this needed to be said at all tells you something important about the moment Season 9 is being released into. To understand what those three words mean, you have to understand what has been happening in the entertainment industry in the years leading up to Season 9. The use of artificial intelligence in creative production, in writing, in animation, in voice work, in music, has become one of the defining arguments in the industry. Writers went on strike in 2023 partly over concerns about studios using AI to replace or undercut human writers. Animators have raised similar concerns about AI-generated imagery being used to replace hand-drawn or traditionally produced work. Voice actors have fought against the use of AI to replicate their voices without consent or compensation. Rick and Morty itself was directly affected by one of these battles. The 2023 Writers Guild of America strike paused production on Season 9. Executive producer Steve Levy confirmed at the time that Season 9 had been partially written and then stopped when the strike began. Work resumed after the strike ended. The people who wrote Season 9 are the same people who walked picket lines in 2023 to protect the principle that human creative work has value that cannot simply be automated away. So when the official description of Season 9 says, "No AI slop," it is not just a marketing line. It is a statement of allegiance. It is the show saying, publicly, and with its name on it, that it stands on the side of the people who make things with their hands and their minds and their time, not on the side of the tools that can produce something that looks like those things without any of the effort or intention behind them. This is a genuine cultural positioning, and it creates a specific kind of promise that extends beyond the usual promises a show makes when it releases a new season. The usual promises are about quality. This will be good. This will be worth your time. This will meet or exceed your expectations. These are promises about the product. No AI slop is a promise about the process. It is saying that whatever is in these 10 episodes got there because a human being thought of it, argued for it in a writer's room, revised it, and cared about it enough to fight for it. It is saying that the show's failures, if it has any, will be the failures of human judgment rather than the failures of automated content generation. It is saying that the imperfections in Season 9, and every season has imperfections, will be the specific, interesting imperfections of people trying hard and not always succeeding, rather than the smooth, characterless imperfections of something produced without genuine intention. This distinction matters to a specific and growing portion of the audience. The people who have been watching Rick and Morty since the early seasons grew up with a show that felt like it was made by people who were genuinely invested in what they were creating. The early seasons had a particular energy, slightly rough, slightly dangerous, occasionally unpolished in ways that felt honest rather than careless. That energy came from the show being made by a small team of writers and animators who were discovering what the show was capable of while making it. It was human in the specific sense of being marked by the personalities and choices and occasional mistakes of the people behind it. As the show grew, as the production became larger and more organized and more industrial, some of that roughness disappeared. This is normal. Shows that get bigger get smoother. The process becomes more reliable. The outcomes become more predictable. The human fingerprints become harder to find under the professional polish. No AI slop is the show claiming those fingerprints are still there. It is saying that Season 9, despite the larger production, despite the new animation studio, despite the guaranteed contract through Season 12 and the simultaneous development of multiple seasons at once, was still made by people who brought themselves to it, who had opinions about what was funny and what was not, who disagreed in the writer's room and had to work through those disagreements, who stayed up too late making something they cared about and then had to tell their families why they were late again. The joke at the end of the official description, "Please watch or we'll have neglected our families for nothing," is a joke. It is also the most honest thing in the entire promotional campaign. It is the show's creators admitting, in the language of comedy, that making this season cost them something real, that it required sacrifice, that it mattered enough to the people making it that they gave things up to make it well. This is the emotional core of the no AI slop positioning. It is not just about technology, it is about investment. It is about the difference between something that was created because someone cared about it and something that was generated because a tool was pointed in a direction and asked to produce output. But the promise creates a risk that is worth naming directly. When you tell an audience that your show was made by real humans who genuinely cared and sacrificed family time and fought for the work, you are asking them to hold you to a higher standard than if you had said nothing. You have made the humanity of the production a selling point, which means that if the episodes feel mechanical, mechanical, if they follow the same structural patterns that the show has settled into, if the jokes land with the reliable efficiency of something produced by a system that has identified what works, rather than the specific, slightly surprising humor of people discovering something funny while trying to say something true, the audience will notice the gap between the promise and the delivery. No AI slop as a tagline is only as powerful as the human quality of what follows it. If Season 9 is genuinely strange, genuinely surprising, genuinely marked by the choices of specific people with specific sensibilities pushing against each other to find something that none of them could have found alone, then the tagline is the truth, and it will land as true. If Season 9 is a well-executed version of what Rick and Morty usually does, consistent and enjoyable and reliably within the range of what the audience expects, then the tagline will start to feel like the thing it was designed to argue against. Content that was generated to meet expectations rather than shatter them, regardless of who generated it. There is an additional layer to this positioning that connects directly to the show's own history and what Season 9 is inheriting from it. Rick and Morty has always been a show that thinks about its own making. It has always been aware of itself as a show, aware of its audience, aware of the difference between doing something real and going through the motions. This self-awareness was one of its defining qualities in the early seasons. The show would sometimes step outside its own story to comment on the story, or use a character's dialogue to make an observation about narrative structure, or build an episode around the mechanics of how stories work and what audiences expect from them. No AI slop is this self-awareness applied to the cultural moment the show exists in right now. It is Rick and Morty doing what Rick and Morty has always done, looking directly at the thing everyone is thinking about and saying something specific about it, rather than pretending it is not there. The entertainment industry's anxiety about artificial intelligence is the thing everyone is thinking about. The show has looked directly at it and planted a flag. This is the right instinct. The show at its best has always been better when it engages with its context rather than hiding from it. The early seasons were great, partly because they were made at a specific cultural moment, the mid-2000s, when a certain kind of ironic detachment had become so common in culture that sincerity felt radical. And they responded to that moment with a show that was both deeply ironic and deeply sincere at the same time. They did not ignore the context. They metabolized it into something that only this show could produce. No AI slop is Season 9 trying to do the same thing in 2026. It is the show metabolizing the anxiety of its current cultural moment and turning it into something that feels like a position rather than a hedge. Whether the episodes inside that positioning deliver on the promise is the question that will be answered between May 24th and July 26th, 2026, when the season runs its full course on Adult Swim. The description promises certified bangers, every episode strong enough to justify the wait. Martyr promised a full tank of gas. Levy promised some of their best work. Owline promised the best character writing ever done. And the official tagline promises that every minute of it was made by people who gave something of themselves to make it. These are not small promises. They are the promises of a show that knows exactly how much is riding on what it is about to do and has chosen to name the stakes publicly rather than hide from them. Season 9 is the proof. Not the proof that the show survives something, which Season 8 already provided. Not the proof that the show can still function without its original co-creator, which Season 7 and Season 8 together provided. The proof that this show, at 9 seasons, with a new animation studio, with a spin-off in development, with a guaranteed contract through at least Season 12, with the memory of a 33% audience score still in the record, is still capable of making something that could only have come from the specific, flawed, deeply human minds of the people who sat in that writer's room and decided what Rick and Morty should be in 2026. That is what no AI slop actually means. Not just that the episodes were written by humans, but that being written by humans still makes a difference. That human creative work, unpredictable, personal, marked by argument and doubt and the occasional brilliant accident, still produces something that no tool can replicate, regardless of how sophisticated those tools become. Season 9 is where that argument gets tested, not in a press release, on screen. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.